Chapter 2 is covering the concepts related to chemistry, matter, and life. A little overview for the current lecture. Well, we'll look into the elements. We'll discuss atoms um, with their structure made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons with their energy levels. We'll look into the chemical bonds of different types of chemical bonds, ionic and covalent, and we'll very quick touch into a chemical equation. We'll look into mixture. We'll describe different types and we'll discuss solvents. We'll define the concepts related to acids, bases, and salts as it pertains to pH and buffers. We'll define isotopes and what radioactivity it is. We'll look into organic compounds. As we know, there are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, along with nucleotides. And also, we'll see how chemistry and matter relates to metabolism. What types of metabolism do we have, which is catabolism and anabolism, and how the energy is produced and used in our body. Please take a moment to stop the current presentation and review the learning objectives for this chapter that are presented in this slide. Let's talk a little bit about chemistry and why this science is important when we are talking anatomy and mainly physiology. So by definition, chemistry represents the science that deals with the composition and properties of matter. There will be very hard for us to understand the mechanism of functioning of different organs, different tissues, different systems in our body without having an understanding what normal chemistry changes are and what the normal and abnormal functioning of the body is. And I will give an example just by going into the digestive system. The way that the food will be processed and digested in the intestinal tract, or when we are looking at the urinary system, how do the kidneys filter the blood and produce the urine? What will be the mechanism involved in the exchange at the level of the respiratory system for breathing, and how the main components are exchanged at the level of the alveoli. All those elements are essential and can be explained through chemistry. From a different point of view, there is a way that different drugs, different substances that are added to our body on purpose or not, they will influence different functions. And that's how we understand the mechanisms that we can treat a condition by using drugs. That's why it is essential for us to look into, to go from the very basic elements of chemistry, to go back to the elements, to atoms, to molecules, and understand how the matter is constructed from its most basic element. I started this lecture by saying that chemistry is the science that deals with properties and composition of matter. But what is matter? How do we define matter? Per definition, matter is anything that takes up some space. It's, in other words, that materials, those materials that the entire universe is made of. We describe matter as being made up of elements. And you remember, just by going back to the meaning of the word in English, elements, elementary, it's something that is very basic. It's something that cannot be divided or dissected into smaller components than what we have right now. So the elements are those very unique substances that put together and combine in different ways will make up all the matter. So matter is pretty much everything we see around us, is every living and non-living things that exist around us. Elements can be classified, into and they are described in the periodic table of the elements, and they are 92 naturally occurring elements. They can be found out in the nature, or we can decompose different matter particles that we have around us into those basic types of elements. For example, if you look at the periodic table, you can see, and you heard about that some of them will be classified as gases, and we have under this category hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen. They can be liquids such as mercury that we find in thermometers back in the day, not that much, we are not using those anymore, very limited use, or in barometers, or they can be solids, like graphite, and graphite is actually your carbon, your pure carbon. So you see that when we are looking in the table of elements, when we are looking at the columns, they do share some certain properties. Those elements are not placed in the table of elements just by chance. They share some physical properties. So going by column, you will see that some of them will be gases, some of them will be liquids, and some of them will be solids in terms of physical properties and how they show themselves. In order to identify, not only in the periodic table of elements, but in general to identify the elements, they have names. Based on their names, they will have a chemical symbol, which is in fact an abbreviation of some old Latin names. Also, they will have, and if you look into this excerpt of the periodic table of elements, if we are looking at sodium, in Latin it's called natrium, so the symbol, the abbreviation will be Na, with always the first letter being capitalized. And you see that there is another number in this tiny box. This is actually their atomic number, or it's related to their atomic structure. Now, out of those 92 elements that we see in the periodic table of elements, only 26 of them are really found in the living organisms. When we are looking at our body, 96% of it can be decomposed to very to those pure elements, and will end up having hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. About 4% of our body will be other additional elements as calcium and sodium, potassium, phosphorus, chlorine, magnesium, iron, and iodine. There are another 13 elements that will be zinc or selenium, copper, chromium, and some others. But all in all, those rest of 13 elements will make up for less than 0.1 of the total body weight. Let's review a little bit this slide. It's a little exercise in terms of recognizing elements. If we are looking at the carbon, and we are looking for the carbon, you can see that it's in the, you see that we have a column. Let me take one of my pens so I can show you. You can see that we have over here number 1 column, number 2 column, and number 3. Under number 4, you can see that the first one of them is carbon. So let's look at it for a second, and you can see that on top of it, we'll see number 6, with represents carbon's atomic number. You will see the name, the carbon, and you see a symbol, which is C. And also you'll see what is called an atomic weight, and we'll describe in a second, and we'll discuss what means the atomic number and the atomic weight. Let's take another example. Let's look at sodium. You will hear a lot about sodium or the natrium, how it's called in Latin. If we look at this, you see that atomic number is 11. Name again is sodium. The symbol is Na, and the atomic weight will be 22.99. Let me take a different one. Let's see iron. And you can see the iron over here. So iron It has an atomic number of 26. You see the name as iron. You see that the abbreviation or the symbol will be Fe, which stands for ferrum in Latin, and the atomic weight will be 55.85. And just by going ahead with that, we can define any other of those elements. Let's review a part of the some of the most common elements that we have in our body. Um, Oxygen, the symbol will be O. Um, Definitely part of the water. It's probably the most common known. H2O is the symbol of water. It's needed um, in our body to metabolize nutrients for energy. We have carbon, that is the basic element found in every single organic compound. So when we define organic elements, organic compounds as opposed to inorganic compounds, we are looking for the presence of carbon and sometimes nitrogen in order to differentiate them. It can be found as in solid structures as well as a gas. Hydrogen, also part of the water, and it's a main component that you will see. We'll discuss a lot about hydrogen um, because it will determine the acidity, how acidic some of the body fluids will be. Nitrogen, the symbol is N, is the element that is present in all proteins and defines proteins by the presence of nitrogen. Calcium, important for the bones and teeth. Um, it's needed in all the muscle contractions and nerve impulse conduction, so it's very important in very essential body functions. And I will add to that also the blood clotting systems. Another one that, another two of them, sorry, three of them. I will jump over phosphorus. It's important. However, I think that I would like to talk a little bit about potassium, also essential for nerve impulse conductions and muscle contraction, just like calcium is. Sodium, that it's part of the salt. The table salt is a component, compound that has in its structure sodium. It's an element very active in maintaining water balance, nerve conduction, and muscle contraction. So if we need to go back and summarize just for 1 second, you see that calcium, potassium, and sodium will be those elements that you need to remember are essential for nerve impulse conduction and muscle contraction. And please remember that iron, with the symbol that is Fe, it's part of the hemoglobin and has very important role in carrying oxygen to the tissues through the red blood cells. Let's summarize a little bit the body's chemical composition by weight. So if we are taking 100% of our weight and we decompose it to the most basic elements, we'll see that up to 65% of our body is oxygen, with a little bit under 20% being carbon. And guess who's the next? The next will be the hydrogen with up to almost 10%. So if we're looking into that and you remember that H2O is water, you'll see that 75% of our body, at least, is actually water. So the rest of that will be nitrogen, 3%. That, remember, is the main component of muscles and proteins. So all the muscles in our body will make up of nitrogen up to 3%, and all the other elements up to the 26 in total that we have in our body from the periodic table of elements will be just 4%. You heard me talking before about the atomic number and the atomic weight, but what is the atom? What will be the atomic structure? So we can define atoms as the smallest unit of all elements. So each of those elements that are described in the periodic table of elements are made out of atoms. So in other words, the atoms will be the smallest complete unit of matter. In theory, they cannot be broken down or changed into another form by regular or ordinary or simple chemical and physical means. However, nowadays, through science and atomic physics, are able to decompose them and use the power of electrons and the atoms a little bit beyond what was believed before. So they're very small, but we were able to define them and to understand their structure. If we are looking at the atomic structure, we see that at the center of the atom, we have a particle that is called the nucleus. The nucleus is composed of two other um, elements inside. One will be the protons that have a positive charge. And when I say a positive charge, I'm looking at electrical charging. And we have neutrons that definitely by their names, it's called neutron, so it has no charging. In other words, the particle that is at the center of the atom has a positive charge. Probably you remember from physics that you discussed in middle school and later in high school. There is an attraction between positive and negative particles, negative charged particles. So if I have at the center the nucleus that is positively charged because of the protons that are inside, I should have somewhere some particles that are negatively charged because they balance each other. And those negatively charged particles are called electrons. Those electrons will gravitate, will move around on orbits around the nucleus. Those orbits have different level of energy. The closest to the nucleus, the higher will be the level of energy, and the higher the connection between the electrons and the nucleus. In other words, it will be harder for that atom to lose one of those electrons if they are very close to the nucleus. However, it will be easier to lose one or to gain one if they are further away on an orbit of, that is not so close to the nucleus. If you want to have a good representation of the atom structure, think about our solar system. It's pretty much the same, having the nucleus as the sun at the center of it and having the planets as the electrons gravitating around the nucleus. Those electrons will define the chemical reactivity of each of those atoms. Now let's look at for 1 second, let's take a look at the oxygen atom. And what can we say? What can we say about the oxygen atom? The number of electrons that the atom will have, and that gives the atomic number for that particle, is actually 8. We'll talk a little bit about levels of energy a little bit later, but you will see that some will be closer, a certain number will be closer, and some of them will be further. If we're looking at it, let's analyze it for a second, the image. We are talking about the number of particles that are inside the nucleus as opposed to the number of particles that are the electrons, and they are gravitating around the nucleus. In red, you'll have the protons. Let's review that. Protons are those positively charged particles. And if you count them, you will see that they are 8. And that gives the atomic number of oxygen. Also, you have 8 neutrons. They are colored green and they have no charging. You see that you have a first level of energy and the second level of energy. We'll discuss them in a second. But if you count all the electrons around, you will see that they are just the same number as the number of protons. Will be 8 negatively now charged particles that make up for the electrons of the oxygen atom. Okay, so let's go a little bit more in depth and discuss the atomic number. Per definition, the atomic number of any element will be equal to the number of protons that are present in the nucleus of this atom. And why do I look at the nucleus only? I'm looking at the nucleus only because I was telling you that those electrons can be lost or can be gained. It's in another way of saying it, every element has little to no control over the number of electrons depending on the physical situation that element is exposed to. However, they will not going to lose any protons. again, we are not going into any kind of nuclear physics because things are changing when we are going to that part of physics. When we are staying into our pure and normal physiological functions, the nucleus of each of those elements will stay the same, will not going to be changed based on what's going on around that atom. So we define the atomic number by the number of protons in an atom's nucleus. In a normal state, or in an equilibrium state, in a balanced state, that atomic number will also equal the number of electrons that are gravitating on the orbits around the nucleus. The atomic number, it's pretty much like a social security number. It's very specific to a certain element. So no two elements will have the same atomic number. Once a particle is losing or gaining protons, will become a different element, and that's in atomic part of the physics that deals with that. In other words, the only element that will have 8 protons will be the oxygen. If we want to give another example, that would be carbon that has 6 protons with, in a balanced state, having 6 electrons gravitating around the nucleus. Let's go a little bit more in-depth understanding about the regarding the energy levels and how the electrons are distributed around the nucleus. And if you take a look at this diagram, you see how it really resembles the solar system, where you have the nucleus in the center is charged positive. And as a result of this positive charging, all the particles that are negative will gravitate around the nucleus. And when we are looking at that, you see that we have some circular lines that the electrons will gravitate, will move around the nucleus, and those are called orbits. We have a first energy level orbit that is a very strong connection, is also called K orbit, where regardless what type of atom we have, regardless if it's an oxygen or a carbon or an iron atom, will have this first energy level will be able to host only 2 electrons. When we are moving into the second one, second energy level that is called L, you will see that there are a little bit more electrons that will be able to be hosted on this level. And on this level, we can have up to 8 electrons. If we are moving further away, you see that the third level will host up to 18 and the fourth level up to 32 electrons. Now, an atom is considered stable the moment that the maximum number of electrons will fulfill that level of energy. So if I have an atom that has 7 electrons, and on the second level of energy, it will be not as stable as one that will have 8, the full number of electrons on that level. We'll review a little bit the information that we just discussed. So we'll have here 2 examples. We'll look at the hydrogen, and hydrogen's atomic number is 1. Is the first element. It has only 1 proton, and as a result of that, we'll have only one electron. Obviously, this 1 electron will sit on the first energy level, and his first energy level, the K1, will have room for 1 more electron to fulfill the and make this particle to be stable. On the other hand, on the second energy level, the hydrogen will have nothing because we don't have any more electrons. And even if we are adding 1 electron to the atom of hydrogen, that will come and will fulfill the first level of energy first before having any other electrons located on the second level of energy. Let's look now into the carbon, and carbon's atomic number will be 6. The first 2 electrons obviously will fill the first level of energy, which will be complete and stable. The rest of them, the rest of 4 electrons, will be placed on the second energy level, and obviously this will be unstable because we can host up to 8 electrons on the second level of energy. So that level will have room for 4 other electrons in order for that atom to become, for that level of energy to become extremely stable. Those the outer level of energy, the most outer level of energy or orbit, will help the atoms to form chemical bonds by putting together or sharing electrons. In other words, when we want to connect two atoms, those can either donate, accept, or purely share electrons. And by doing that, we have a connection between two atoms. That donation, accepting, or sharing of electrons will allow to fill the outermost energy level and make it stable. That's why the compounds of different atoms are stable molecules. I would like to review again with you, and we'll look again to the carbon first, and you can say that the carbon has 6 protons, so 6 positive molecules in the nucleus. As a result of that, we'll have 6 negative particles that will gravitate on the orbits. 2 on the first level of energy, always 2, never more than 2, and the rest of 4 will be on the second level of energy. We are looking again into the oxygen that has 8 positive particles in the nucleus, 8 protons, that will be balanced by 8 negative particles that will gravitate on different orbits. We'll always have 2 on the first level of energy, and the rest of them, 8 minus 2, will be 6. There will be 6 electrons on the second level of energy for this molecule, for this atom. Question number 1. Which element makes up of the greatest percentage of body weight? And the options are A, nitrogen, B, oxygen, C, potassium, or D, sodium. The element that makes up the greatest percentage of body weight will be oxygen. If you remember, I was telling you that it's up to 65%. Question number 2. The atomic number of iron is 26. How many protons does iron have? Option A is 13, option B, 26, option C, 39, or option D, 52. The correct answer for this question is option B, 26. If the atomic number of iron is 26, and we know per definition that the atomic number of an element is given by the number of protons that this element has in its nucleus, the correct option will be only option B, that says 26. Let's see now what are the chemical bonds. Now, those atoms that we described before as elemental or elements, elemental particles or elements, will interact with each other. And they will do that in order to to realize a stable outermost energy level. When they do connect with each other, it can be 2 or more atoms, but let's start with 2 to understand the process. If we have 2 atoms that will connect with each other, that connection is called a bond. During this bond, I have 2 options. It's either that an atom will transfer its electron from the outermost level, and the other atom will accept it, and by doing that, one will become positive and the other negative, and by attraction they will connect. Or they can put together the outer layer electrons, will share them, and the electrons will gravitate among those in between those 2 particles, to those atoms, and this is called a covalent bond. But we'll describe each of them in more detail. What I would like you to remember at this point is that the electrons can be transferred and accepted, or can be shared in order to form a connection between 2 or more atoms that is called a chemical bond. Before we are describing each of those types of chemical bonds, I would like to describe what is called the valence. And the valence is defined as the number of bonds an atom needs to fill its outermost level of energy. And for an example, we'll take the carbon atom. If you remember, the carbon has 6 protons. That means um, the carbon will have 6 protons in its nucleus, equivalent to 6 electrons on the outer layers. First level of energy to be fulfilled needs 2. That leave us on the second level of energy with 4 electrons. So this will give the valence. For C, the valence will be 4. Let's discuss now the types of chemical bonds. First one that we'll discuss is what is called an ionic bond. An ionic bond is formed when one atom is donating and another one is accepting. If we are looking at the sodium, you will see that the sodium is made out of the sodium atomic number is 11. First level of energy will be 2. Second level of energy will be 8 electrons. Together will be 10. Now I see that in sodium, actually, I will have an extra level of energy that we didn't discuss before, will be the third level of energy with just 1 electron. Remember that the further it is from the nucleus, the smaller or the weaker the attraction is. In other words, to become stable, sodium has um, an ability to lose that outer electron, to donate it to a different atom. If it's losing that electron, sodium becomes charged positive, and it will be called a cation. And this is because now the number of protons, which is 11 in the nucleus, is higher than the number of electrons that I'm left with, which is just 10. If we are taking the example of table salt, which is natrium chloride, the sodium will donate 1 particle to the chlorine atom. The chlorine atom has 17 protons that corresponds to 17 electrons. However, the chlorine can accept easily 1 on its outer third level of energy because, again, they have 7 on the outer third level. By accepting an electron, chlorine will become negatively charged now because the number of electrons will be 18 for the chlorine, while the protons in the nucleus for chlorine is still 17. It doesn't change. Now I will have a positive particle, the sodium, that will be attracted by a negative particle, chlorine. Those two opposites will attract each other and will connect, forming what is called an ionic bond due to their different opposite charged qualities. Let's review now. Again, I have sodium with 11 protons that makes up for 11 electrons in a normal atom, that they are distributed into 2 for the first level, 8 for the second level, and the third one having just 1 electron to make up for 11 electrons. This will be lost and transferred to the chloride atom that will actually have 17 protons that makes up for 2 on the first level, 8 on the second level, with 7 on the third level. Now, the chloride will accept 1 electrode, will become negatively charged, that will attract now positively charged sodium, and together connected, they make sodium chloride, which is the table salt that we all know. When we are talking about those compounds, those particles that are made out of ionic bonds, we can discuss now electrolytes. So those ionically bond substances have a quality. They can be easily dissolved in water. And you know that because you know that salt will dissolve in water. While placed in water, those atoms are able to separate themselves in ions. Once they separate, the positively charged ones will be called cations, while the negatively charged ones will be called anions. You'll say, what's actually the importance of electrolytes? When do we even discuss electrolytes when we talk anatomy and physiology? What's the importance of that? And in order for us to understand the physiology, a lot of the physiologic processes and mechanisms in our body are performed through the help of um, positively or negatively charged particles. In other words, through the help of those electrolytes or anions or cations, in general called ions. Um, there is, let's say, for example, that's a huge relevance and importance to have proper concentration of intracellular and extracellular fluids. And the balance between those fluids is highly determined by the concentration of the ions. There is a high importance of sodium and potassium in transmission of electric signals throughout the whole length of our nervous system, or at the level of transmission of impulses from the nervous system to glands or muscles. Also, those ions are important in muscle contraction itself. And to give you some examples, when we do an electrocardiogram, we are registering the heart's electrical activity that is highly dependent on the activity and the movement of those ions um, in and out through the cellular membranes. Now, just similar to the electrocardiogram, we can perform an electroencephalogram that will record the brain's electrical activity. That again is the result of ions moving in and out in different processes that we'll discuss in chapter 3 and 4 that will determine the electric activity of our brain. Beside the sodium and potassium that are essential ions, we have others. For example, here in this slide, we are giving the example of calcium, that you see that it has a 2 plus. That means that actually calcium is donated 2 electrons. So that particle becomes doubly charged positive because it has 2 extra protons in the nucleus, as opposed to the number of electrons that are left. Very important ion for blood clotting and muscle contraction, as well as we have the anion of carbonate that is essential in the pH regulation. The second type of bond that two atoms can develop is called a covalent bond. And co, we are going back to terminology, co means together. And valent or valence comes from the number of shared electrons. In this type of bond, we have the molecules that will share the electrons. The electrons will not going to be donated and accepted, but they will be shared. And actually, in nature, if we are looking, this is the most common type of chemical bond that we have in our bodies. It's probably the most common chemical bond. And if we are looking, we have two types of um, covalent bonds. We have the non-polar, when the electrons are shared equally. When we are using term polar, when we have the polarization of something, just going back to the meaning in English of the word, polarizing something meaning it's more focused on something. While when I'm saying non-polar, it means that the electrons are not focused on one of the particles or one of the nucleuses. They are nuclei, I'm sorry. They are actually shared equally by two particles. And you can see in this picture over here, we put them together. And if you remember, hydrogen was in need of one electron to fulfill the outer layer. So if we have two molecules of hydrogen here, those electrons will once gravitate around this one, and second will gravitate around this one. And that's how they are actually shared by the molecule of hydrogen. And the hydrogen molecule, we are writing it when it's stable as H2. The second type of covalent bond will be the polar one. And Remember, polar means that they are more focused on one of them. In this type of bond, and we have here the example of water. You can see here that is H2 and O, one molecule of oxygen with two molecules of, one atom of oxygen with two atoms of hydrogen. You can see that from one hydrogen and the oxygen, we have electrons that are shared this way, and from the other atom of hydrogen, the um, electrons are shared like this. So you will have some of the electrons shared between those two particles and some of the electrons shared only by those two particles. So in other words, there is a polarization of electrons. They are not shared completely equal between all three particles. You heard me before talking about molecules. So let's see, how do we define the term molecule? So a molecule represents the smallest unit of a covalently bonded substance that retains, in fact, all the properties of that substance. In other words, two or more atoms that will be held together by covalent bonds, but made out of the same two types of atoms, because you see in the example that's the oxygen and hydrogen, and O3 is called ozone. You definitely heard about ozone. Those are molecules. When I have different atoms, not the same type of atom, that will hold together by ionic or either ionic or covalent bonds, that will make up a compound, and that's the smallest type of particle. Now you can see that a compound is like in the example of sodium chloride or water or carbon dioxide. Sodium chloride is your table salt, H2O is the water, and CO2 is what we exhale, is the carbon dioxide. In order for us to understand chemical equation, I would like you to understand that in normal life and in everyday environment, um, when chemical reaction happens, atoms are not created and destroyed. They are simply rearranged. And by rearranging them, we are destroying and recreating those chemical bonds. In other words, the chemical equation will be this kind of shorthand way that I can represent a chemical reaction. So we are reading those chemical equations just like we are reading regular English language. We will do that left to right. And for example, if you're looking into what is called an irreversible reaction, you see that I have an element that is A that will react with an element B, and they will form an element that we call C. Once C formed, this C element is a completely new one that will not going to break down into A or B. When we are looking into a reversible reaction, we have, let's say, a form D that reacts with a form E. Together, they will develop form F. However, at any given moment, F can break down into D and E. This is called reversible, and when we are representing it, you see that we have this double-sided arrows, that they are going both ways, as opposed to an irreversible reaction that will have only one side arrow, meaning C will not going to go back to A and B no matter what we are trying to do with that. While in this one, F is continuously created and decomposed back into its original elements. Question number 3. What bond forms between two atoms that share their electrons equally? And the options are hydrogen bond, B, ionic bond, C, nonpolar bond, or D, polar bond. The correct answer for two atoms that share their electrons equally is called a non-polar bond. Again, when we are sharing something equally, there is no polarization, there is no focus on one atom as opposed to the other, and that's why it's called a non-polar bond. Hydrogen bond is not even a thing. Ionic bond forms when the electrons are not shared but are transferred, and the polar bond is the ones that an atom is preferred and the electrons are not shared equally. Question number 4. Which term best describes the sodium ion, or how its symbol is Na plus? A, anion, B, atom, C, electrolyte, or D, element? Now, this question is interesting, and I will tell you why. Because you can have two options here, but it's the way that is formulated, and you will see that when you will analyze throughout the program the questions, multiple choice questions, you need to read all your um, um, choices before choosing one. So let's look one by one. So the first option will be anion. Well, we know that the ions can be anions or cations. The positive one is called a cation and not an anion with A, but with a Ca. So A is not an option. So I will go and see if I have a cation through the options, and I don't have one. So I'm going to move to B. So B says an atom. Well, this is not an atom because this is a particle that is charged, either positive or negative. In this case, it's positive. But an atom is not charged, is a neutral state of that element. So B is not an option. C says electrolyte, and that will be your correct option because ions are also electrolytes. It's another word. It's a synonym for ions. So as a general term, yes, sodium is an electrolyte, which will be split into positive and negative ions that are called positive ones, cations, and negative ones, anions. But as a general term, sodium is an electrolyte. And D, an element, well, it is an element. However, that's not what the question is going with me because they want the term that best describes the sodium ion. That's why I'm telling you always read all your options. If it's an element, yes, it is. By all means, it's in the periodic table of elements. However, that doesn't best describe because I'm talking here about the sodium ion, not just sodium. If it would have been just sodium, element will be a correct answer. But the best one that describes this in this sentence will be electrolyte. Question number 5. Which chemical is not a compound? And the options are A, carbon dioxide, B, water, C, sodium chloride, or D, oxygen. And oxygen, the molecule. In other words, I kind of gave you the answer when I was giving you the options because remember, a molecule is made out of the same types of atoms, 2 or 3 put together, and the only one that is made by the same type of atom or element is the oxygen molecule, while compound is made out of different types of atoms or elements. So the correct option is option D. In order to understand what a mixture is, I will need to make a little bit of introduction and to explain that not all elements or compounds that we encounter out there in the nature will react chemically when brought together. And for example, by now you probably remember from high school or even middle school that the air that we breathe, it's a combination of gases. Most of it will be nitrogen, about 20% is oxygen, there will be different quantities of carbon dioxide depending on the environment where we are, and definitely there will be other substances along the way. However, the air stays air and is defined like that, and those elements that we have, nitrogen, oxygen, CO2, they do not react with each other. Kind of in the same way the blood plasmids, which is the fluid part of our blood, it's made out of a combination of a variety of components, and a lot of substances will be what we call dissolved, just like the salt will dissolve in the water, will be dissolved in that fluid part of the blood, and they will not react with each other most of the times. Just in specific situations, they will do. So, in other words, those type of combination made out of more than one component, more than one compound or elements, they are called mixtures. They are blends of two or more substances. Mixtures can be also classified in different types, and we need to know how they are defined, and we'll give some examples so we know how to differentiate them. So the first one will be what is called a solution. A solution is called a homogeneous mixture that is made out of two or more substances. But we'll have one substance that is called a solute that will dissolve in another substance, which is called the solvent. In other words, let's consider that we have a solution of salt. We put salt in water. The solute, the substance that will dissolve, will be the salt. The solvent, or the substance that dissolves the salt, will be water. Another example will be the table sugar or the sucrose that dissolves as well in the water. We call it a solution because, again, it's a homogeneous mixture. A homogeneous mixture means that when I'm dissolving the salt and the sugar and I'm looking, just by observing that solution, when I'm looking at it, it's completely clear. I do not see particles suspended in it. I don't see particles that deposit at the base of that container on the bottom of it. It looks just like water. If you are not tasting it, you don't know that something was dissolved in it. Another type will be the suspension. Now, homo means equal or the same. The suspension is a heterogeneous mixture. Hetero means different. In this type of mixture, we have one substance that is dispersed in the other one. However, those two substances will separate. The one that is dispersed in the, let's say, in the fluid type will settle unless constantly mixed. And one example of that would be the red plasma blood cells, the RBCs, that will sediment, and sedimentation means will settle down in a test tube when we are taking a blood sample. If we are taking a blood sample, initially it's all red and nice. If we are putting the test tube on a stand and look at it a few hours later, you will see how the red blood cells are depositing sedimented down at the bottom of the tube, leaving the plasma, the fluid part of the blood, on top of it, which is yellowish. We have a lot of suspensions, especially that we are using in the medical field, like the milk of magnesia and some of the oral antibiotics that are the preferred type of product that we are giving for children. Those are all suspensions. We need to mix them. We need to shake them in order to distribute evenly the substance that is dispersed in the fluid part in order to have a mixture. It's called, again, a heterogeneous. And we have a third type that is called a colloid. And the colloid is also a heterogeneous mixture. However, in this one, the suspended particles remain distributed evenly based on the fact that they are having small sizes and they have opposing charges of the particles. And I know that it's a little bit more complicated to understand that, but what keeps them from sedimenting like in a suspension is the fact that on the bottom may be positive particles and on top may be also positive particles, and you know that same type of particles will kind of dissipate, will push each other away. That's why in the blood plasma, a lot of the proteins that are in the blood plasma, they're all positive charged, or most of them are positive charged particles, and that's why they stay suspended, because they are kind of reject each other. Cytosol, which is part of the cell, you will see, we'll discuss it when we discuss the cell in the next chapters, is just another example of the same thing. There are a lot of molecules suspended in that fluid part as well. We get now to the point where we discuss the water, because water is that fluid part that will allow for all those mixtures, both in our bodies and in the outside world. Um, Definitely is the most abundant, probably compound or component of our body. Um, you know by now, and it's not news for you, that no living creature, no plant or animal can live very long without water, and it's critical for almost every single physiological process in our body. When we are losing water, that process is called dehydration, and that can become a very serious threat to our body. However, gaining too much water, the hyperhydration, um, can also have consequences. It's less common, uh, less encountered as a pathological element in humans to have an overwhelming amount of water in our body. Dehydration is probably the most common. So we discuss water, and we emphasize that because the water is needed to dissolve a lot of those substances that we have in our body. And in other words, it's seen as the universal solvent. Again, the substance that will dissolve into is called a solvent, and the one that dissolves, that will be dissolved into the solvent, is called a solute. Um, there will be some substances that are attracted and will be easily dissolved in water. Those are called hydrophilic. Uh, Whenever you have a word that ends in philic, it means it's something that loves that element. When I said hydro means water, philic means loving. So hydrophilic, water loving. And there will be other substances like the fats. You probably tried to put together water and oil at least once in your life, and you see how they completely separate themselves. No matter how hard you're shaking them, they will kind of combine for a little bit, and after that will separate again. And those are called hydrophobic. Phobic is fearing of, or having a repulsion, or rejecting it. Hydrophobic. In terms of qualities of water, we can say that water it's a very stable compound, and we see it as a liquid at ordinary temperature. Will freeze when the temperature drops under 0 degrees Celsius, and that's how the scale for Celsius was developed. When the water is freezing, that's considered 0 Celsius. When the water is boiling, it's considered 100 degrees Celsius. For Fahrenheit, freezing temperature for water will be 32, and the boiling temperature for water will be 212 Fahrenheit. Just to emphasize again, water is essential and participates in almost all the body chemical reactions. And it's needed for those processes, and it results, it's a product, a result of a lot of the physiological reactions in our body. So a lot of the water that we eliminate was produced from the reactions in our body, not necessarily just ingested. Question number 6. Which term describes a substance that dissolves another substance? And the options are A, mixture, B, solute, C, solution, or D, solvent. The substance that dissolves another substance is called a solvent. Again, a substance that dissolves another substance, and probably if you have ever remodel your home or try to remodel a piece of furniture, you know that you are using a solvent to clean the paint before, while the substance that will be dissolved into another substance was called a solute. Solutions and mixtures are a combination of a solute and solvent. Question number 7. Which substance is termed the universal solvent? A, an acid, B, a base, C, carbon, or D, water? The substance that is termed the universal solvent is water. We'll look now into what our acids, base, and salts represent from a chemical point of view. I will start by defining an acid. So an acid is that chemical substance that has the ability of releasing a hydrogen ion when dissolved in water. So now we are going back, and you will see that acid, base, and salts are all related to ionic bonds. They all result in ions when dissolved in water. In other words, an acid will eliminate that proton, that hydrogen ion that you see here, when dissolved in water. Probably the most common and easy example that I can give you is the hydrochloric acid, which is the acid that every single one of us has in the stomach and is produced by the stomach glands. Hydrochloric acid, when combined with water, will decompose itself and will release a hydrogen ion from one point, which is a positive charged particle, and a negative charged particle, which is the chloride ion. On the other hand, compared to that, I have a base, and the base is that substance that is able to release hydroxide ions as well as accepting hydrogen ions. So remember, hydroxide will be released while hydrogen will be accepted. The example will be the sodium hydroxide that, when combined with water, will give you will decompose into a sodium ion and the hydroxide ion. Now, look what happens if I put this one. In other words, before going into that, an acid will always be positively charged, will eliminate the positively charged particles, while a base will produce the negatively charged particles. Guess what happens if I put together this particle and this particle together? In other words, if I add hydrochloric acid to sodium hydroxide, and you can see it here, if I say this plus this one, it's a combination of those two and those two, those four elements. So in other words, this will combine with this one, and this one will combine with this one. And as a result of that, I will have a salt and water. In other words, if I put together an acid and a base, per definition, my result will be a salt and water. This reaction is called a neutralizing reaction. The acid and the base, a substance that releases hydrogen ions and the substance that releases hydroxide ions, will neutralize each other to create something that is neither harmful, not doing anything, because you know that acid and base can be harmful. Now, based on what I was telling you and how those acids and base are defined, let's see what is a pH scale and how do we look into that. So a pH scale is based on multiples of 10. It's a scale, first of all. And each pH unit on this scale represents a tenfold change in the number of hydrogen and hydroxide ions present. So the acidity or the alkalinity, the acidity, the level of how acid something is, or alkalinity, the level of how basic something is, will be indicated in those pH units. So this scale runs, as you can see in this image, from 1 to 14, where, from 0, you don't have it in the scale as 0, but from 0 to 14, in other words, 0 will be very acidic, while 14 will be very base. And you can see that the gastric acid, the hydrochloric acid, is 1, lemon juice is 2, green apples are 3, tomatoes are 4, so you can see that tomatoes are highly acidic. Dark coffee will be 5, still acidic, which, interesting, milk is 6. It goes into the neutral range. We have the water is completely neutral at 7. Eggs will be 8, and as we are going through that, baking soda is 9, and we are going into bleach. If you see it's 12, we become more and more base. Our body likes the pH range to be, the normal body fluid should be in the range of 7.35 to 7.45. So you can see that the range of pH that needs to be maintained in our body is extremely narrow. It's like 0.1 range. Everything that is less than 7.35 is considered acidosis, a state of acidosis of the body, while everything that is over 745 will be considered an alkalosis state. And when I'm giving you those numbers, we are looking into the pH of the blood. If we are going into the pH of other body fluids, you'll see that they are changing slightly based on the function of those fluids. Now, urine on average will have a pH of 6. However, it may range from 4.6 to 8, and that's because the urinary system main function is to maintain the balance, the homeostasis, the equilibrium that we need to see in our body. So the urine is able to either eliminate a lot of acids or to save the acids based on what changes happen at that point in our body. Again, just to summarize, you can see that in the neutral area we have the water. Human blood is in between 7.4 and 7.45 and 7.35, very close to neutral. Sodium bicarbonate is 8.4, with bleach 9.5 and lye 13. Once we're going, and that's going into the base scale. If we're going into the acid part of the scale, you see again coffee about 5, tomato juice 4.2. All the soda drinks being very acidic, so now you understand the damage that sodas can do to our stomach or to our teeth. Lemon juice about 2 and the stomach around 1. In the context of acid and base, we have an interesting element, and that will be the element of buffering. Now, whenever we have a normal person, a healthy person, the body fluids are balanced all the time for the pH to be maintaining that very narrow range. And that can be done with the help of buffers. Those buffers are a system, and this system prevents all those changes either to the side of acidity or alkalinity, because they can act as an acid or a base based on the needs of the body. Whenever the body is going into too much acidity, they will add the base component to bring it back to the normal range. And whenever the body fluids are going towards the basic or the alkaline side in their fluids, the buffer system will eliminate the protons, will add the protons to balance it back into the range. Question number 8. Which substance always accepts hydrogen ions? A, an acid, B, a base, C, a buffer, or D, a salt? The substance that always accepts hydrogen ions or the positive charged particles will be a base. Question number 9. Which substance always has a pH below 7? A, an acid, B, a base, C, a buffer, or D, a salt? A substance that always has a pH below 7 is called an acid. And if you remember, the range of a pH scale is between 0 and 14, with 7 kind of being the neutral zone. So everything that is under 7 is considered an acid, and everything that is over 7 will be considered a base. A buffer, if you remember, is that system that can act either as an acid or a base based on the needs of the body, while a salt is neither an acid or a base, is a neutral compound. Question number 10. Which substance is most important in maintaining a relatively constant pH in body fluids? A, an acid, B, a base, C, a buffer, or D, a salt? The most important substance involved in maintaining a relatively constant pH in the body fluids is called the buffer. If you remember, the buffer can act either as an acid or as a base to counterbalance the either extreme, not necessarily extreme, but an increased alkalinity or an increased acidity in the body. You remember at the beginning of this lecture, we were discussing the elements and how do we represent them in the periodic table of elements. And among other stuff, beside the atomic number, there was another number that was written down on the bottom of each of those tiny boxes that said atomic weight. And atomic weight can be different. In the same element, we can have different atomic weights for the same atomic number. Again, atomic number is the number of protons. That will always be the same, and the protons are the positively charged particles. The atomic weight will change if we are changing the number of neutrons. Those neutral particles that are included in the nucleus of an atom. So we define an isotope, different forms of the same element that have a different atomic weight based on a different number of neutrons. For example, we have 3 different isotopes of carbon. We have carbon 12, 13, and 14. They all have the same number of protons. That will be 6 in all of those cases. However, they have a different number of neutrons. We have carbon 12 that has just 6 neutrons, and the atomic weight is 12. We have 7 neutrons for carbon 13 that has an atomic weight of 13, and we have 8 neutrons for carbon 14 that will give the atomic weight of 14. And it's the same with other isotopes as well, among the range of isotopes in nature. Those particles can be stable or they can be unstable. And when they are unstable, they are called radioactive. When they are unstable, we call that an ability to fall apart or to radiate, to give off subatomic particles or electromagnetic energy waves. And those are called gamma rays. Once an element that is an isotope that is unstable, is falling apart and is emitting energy or rays, we can have a different range, and we have different types of energy waves that can penetrate different types of particles. Those qualities of an element are called radioactivity, and they are highly and extensively used in the medical field. You have the alpha rays that can penetrate just the air. Pretty much a piece of paper will block them. We'll have the beta waves that will be prevented to go through just by any kind of plastic, while the gamma and the X-rays, those are more harmful, and to prevent their penetration, we need lead. We do use isotopes in, like I was telling you, we can use the X-rays for the X-rays, the radiography that we are doing, and CT scans. We do use radioisotopes to treat in the treatment of cancer. because they will penetrate and destroy tumor cells. We can use them in diagnostic procedures. Whenever they are administered to a patient, and we are trying to detect them in different areas. They are called tracers, and we can even treat, not only diagnose, but also treat thyroid problems with, for example, radioactive iodine. Question number 11. A form of an element that differs in its atomic weight from another form of the same element is A. Compound, B. Ion, C. Isotope, or D. Molecule. A form of an element that differs in its atomic weight from other forms of the same element is called an isotope. We're going to discuss now a more complex type of molecules that they are called organic compounds, and they can be found everywhere in the living things, and their main common denominator is the fact that they will contain the element carbon. Carbon has the ability to form covalent bonds with many other elements, can be even covalent bond to other carbon atoms to form sometimes very long chains. And that's pretty much one of the characteristics of the organic compounds, that they can be very large and complex molecules. They can be considered, those molecules can be considered the building blocks when they are simple molecules. They are called monomers, mono meaning one. They will build together and connect together in very long chains. The main types of organic compounds that we'll discuss today are carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. We will discuss the nucleotides as well, but they are not falling into the same category with the previous three that I mentioned. Let's look at the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are building blocks for the simple sugars. When they're simple, we call them monosaccharides. The saccharine of saccharose means sugar. So the building block for the carbohydrates will be the glucose. The glucose is the simple sugar that would circulate in the blood as the basic cellular nutrient. Whenever two molecules of carbohydrates, two monosaccharides, will connect together, it will be called a disaccharide. And an example of that will be sucrose, or the table sugar, that is made out of one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose, or the sugar that we found in the nature, in the plants. Whenever I have a big linked chain of monosaccharides, that will be called the polysaccharides. And the example for that would be the glycogen, that is the storage form of carbohydrates in the animals, mainly in the liver, and the starch, that is the form of deposit of large linked monosaccharides in plants. So let's review it really quick, and you can see the monosaccharides is one molecule, while the disaccharides, two molecules, will be, as an example, the sucrose or table sugar, and the polysaccharides will be the glycogen or the starch in plants. The second type of organic compound that we'll discuss today are the lipids, that have in common one big quality, the fact that they are not soluble in water. They are hydrophobic, and they can be found everywhere in the body. Most of the time are referred as fats. The simple fats are made out of what is called the glycerol. It can be found combined with in the combination with three fatty acids, and then they are called triglycerides because of that components of three fatty acids having the tri prefix in front of it. Another type of lipid that we have in the body will be the phospholipids, that are lipids that will contain the phosphorus element. And another kind of lipid will be the steroids, that will contain a ring of carbon atoms that is called a sterol And an example of that, probably the most important one, is the cholesterol one. It's the basic unit that will be found to make up the steroid hormones, including cortisol and testosterone and estrogen. The triglycerides are very important for our body. They will insulate because they are hydrophobic. They repel the water. They will insulate the body, will protect organs, and will be able to store energy as well, while the phospholipids are very important component of the cell membranes. Definitely steroids are their main function is in regulating body function as hormones. So let's look at the glycerol. You can see that we have here an example of a triglyceride that is made out of a glycerol part and will have three individual fatty acids. If we are looking at it and we are asking ourselves how many carbon atoms are in the glycerol, you can see that they have 1, 2 over here, and 3. So we have 3 carbon atoms in the glycerol. But if you can look down in each of those fatty acids, you can see that there is a multitude of carbon. And if you really look into that, you can see that each of them can be similar or different. And by doing that, you can see that it's a high combination. We can develop all kinds of triglycerides. The last type of organic component that we discussed today are the proteins. And what's very important, and it's a common denominator among all the proteins, is the fact that in addition to the fact that all the organic compounds will have carbon in them, they will have, beside the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, they will have an element of nitrogen. They may or may not contain also sulfur or phosphorus based on their functions. So the proteins, we consider them to be the body structural material. They can be found in muscles and in bones and in all connective tissues. They also are part of what gives our eye color or the hair color and the skin color. They give that pigment to us. A very specific type of proteins is the category of enzymes, and we'll discuss those in a second. Proteins, if we are looking at them, they are complex molecules. They are composed of what is called monomers or amino acids. There are about 20 amino acids that exist in our body that make up most of the proteins that we have. Each of those amino acids will have an acid group that is defined as COOH and an amino group, which is an NH2. Those will be attached to either side of a carbon atom and will be linked to a hydrogen atom. The bond that is formed between the acid group and the amino group is called a peptide bond. So just to review a little bit about the amino acids, if you're looking at this slide, you can see that we have a carbon atom in the middle and a hydrogen atom connected to that. We have an amino group on one side with an acidic group on the other side. I was telling you that enzymes are actually part of the proteins class. They have an essential role in hundreds of chemical reactions that take place within the cells at any given moment in our body. They are called catalysts or substances. Catalyst, if you're going back to the meaning of the word in English, means to increase the speed of a phenomenon, of a chemical reaction. And that is needed to maintain the rate of those reactions to a level that sustains life. Now, by controlling the activity of those enzymes, the body will actually control the chemical reaction. So those enzymes work only on specific substances, so they are very much what is called substrate specific. And they do work via a lock and key mechanism. They will have a specific type of, they will have a specific shape that will allow for substances to connect to them to produce a certain reaction, and after that they will release back the substances that were involved in the process of combining. In the process, the enzyme um, will not be changed on itself. However, those enzymes can be denaturated, can be modified or destroyed in harsh conditions. That can be extreme temperatures or extreme pH, either acidic or alkaline. So this is what I was trying to explain to you. I would like substrate 1 and 2 to connect and produce something else. I would like to combine those two, but they don't want to combine on themselves. They will not gonna connect well together. And that's why I have these enzymes that is perfectly fitted to include substrate 2 and substrate 1. And by connecting them inside the enzyme will allow them to combine and to result the product. And you can see that the product is eliminated outside. I don't see any more substrate 1 and 2, and the enzyme was not changed in any shape or means in the process. It will stay just the same and can restart the process again. It can be seen as a mold, but the enzyme is a little bit more than that. Will also accelerate the process, not just making it happen. Nucleotides. So this is seen nowadays as an additional class of organic compounds, and the nucleotides will be made out of a nitrogenous or nitrogen-containing subunit, which is called a base. Please don't confuse that with an alkaline base. It's just a base as a foundation. We'll have a sugar. Usually the sugar is called either ribose or a related sugar called deoxyribose. So I have R for ribose and D for deoxyribose, and you'll see in a second how that connects with their names. And we have a phosphate group, which contains obviously phosphorus. So again, a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate. Based on the type of the sugar, that can be ribose or deoxyribose, they will become the building blocks for the nucleic acids that are called deoxyribonucleic acids or DNA, or ribonucleic acids or RNA. And those are involved in the transmission of genetic traits, and will be the expression in the cell, and they are the base of the genes formation. We will discuss them in chapter 3 way more in detail. Another type of nucleotides can be seen in what is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which represents the cell's highest energy compound. It can be seen as the batteries, where the cells are storing energy that can be used periodically whenever the cell is in need for that. Question number 12. Which element is the basis of organic chemistry? A, carbon, B, hydrogen, C, nitrogen, or D, oxygen? The basis of organic chemistry, again, is carbon. All 4 elements that are presented in these questions will be found in organic compounds. However, the element that is essential for a compound or a molecule to be called organic will be carbon. Question number 13. Which organic compound catalyzes metabolic reactions? A, carbohydrate, B, enzyme, C, lipid, or D, nucleotide? The catalyzer for metabolic reaction is called an enzyme. Question number 14. Which organic compound is used to store genetic information? A, carbohydrate, B, enzymes, C, lipid, or D, nucleotide? The organic compound used to store genetic information is called nucleotide. Question number 15. A substance that has a name ending in ase is most likely A. Carbohydrate, B. Enzyme, C. Lipid, or D. Nucleotide. A substance that has a name ending in ase is most likely an enzyme. And this is part of the terminology that I would like you to start remembering. Everything that ends on an ase, lipase, amylase, those are all enzymes. We'll discuss now about metabolism and um, all those chemical reactions that will sustain life and occur in the body throughout every single system in our body. They together make up for what is called metabolism. And in the metabolism, we have two basic types of activities. One of them is called catabolism, when complex substances will be broken down into very simple components. Proteins, let's say, will be broken down into amino acids. Fats will be broken down into fatty acids and cholesterol. And we have a second type of metabolism that is called anabolism, which simple substances will be used to manufacture more complex materials. The anabolism is the reverse process from catabolism, when we are building back, we are synthesizing proteins, let's say, from amino acids. Now, for catabolism, when we are breaking down the substances, energy will be released, and this energy will be stored in the form of the ATP. If you remember the ATP, please see it as the batteries, the energy storage units for the cells. When I'm building up substances, when I'm creating them, more complex structures, anabolism, then I will need energy for that, to create that. And in order to have energy, I will use the ATP, I will use the energy that was stored into those molecules. And I was talking about energy so much until now. So let's see, let's look into energy and types of energy. So it's obviously that body cells need energy for all the processes that happens inside them. So what kind of energy do we know that they exist? So one type of energy is what is called kinetic energy, and that is the energy of movement. Kinetos means moving in Greek. Any kind of matter that is in movement will be defined by some types of kinetic energy. There is all kind of forms of kinetic energy. Probably the one that is the most obvious is the one that we see something really moving in front of us, or we are moving, and that's obvious. It's less obvious when we are thinking about radiant energy, like the sun energy, sunlight, or heat, or sound, or X-rays. All those elements are forms of energy, and they have a kinetic energy because they are moving, they are traveling through air, and this energy is the result of movements of, in fact, electrons that are passing through either air or wires, or depending on the form of energy. So if we have the energy of movement, we probably have an energy that is stored, and that is called potential energy. Just like in English, go back to the meaning of word potential. It's called potential because it has the potential to become kinetic energy. It's just stored right now. I have it in batteries and can be used when needed. And examples of that would be chemical energy that is stored in some compounds and will be released out there once we are processing that compound, or we can have gravitational energy as potential energy. One thing that I would like you to remember is that one very important element is the fact that energy can be converted from one form to another. And just follow this diagram for a second, and you can see how the sun, together with CO2 and water, is transformed by the plants in growing and developing. And at a certain point, the example here is an apple tree that will use the sun energy, the carbon dioxide and the water to produce the apples. And inside the apples, we have sugars, which are organic compounds that are stored in that fruit. When we are eating that fruit, we are ingesting this type of energy that is engulfed in the chemical bonds inside the fructose, inside the sugars inside that apple. At the level of my body cells, my cells are able to decompose and break that chemical energy of the fructose. And by catabolic reactions, by working on that compound and decomposing it, will result CO2, water, and energy, the ATP. Energy can be stored or can be used, and I can have enough energy to run and move. And you can see how energy is actually never destroyed. It's just converted from one form to another. Question number 16. A reaction in which simple compounds are assembled into more complex compounds is most accurately described as A. Anabolic reaction, B. Catabolic reaction, C. Homeostatic reaction, or D. Metabolic reaction. Before I'm going to give you the answer, let's look a little bit of the question. This is a little bit more wordy and definitely needs to a little bit more attention, and sometimes we need to read those kind of questions twice. So let's go back. And the question is asking me that I need to define that reaction in which simple compounds will be assembled into more complex compounds. So in other words, I'm building up something. So that will be, if I remember correctly, what we described before in terms of metabolism will be an anabolic reaction. I'm creating something because catabolic reaction is decomposing and releasing the energy. But here, I'm taking simple compounds and putting them together to construct, to build something. Catabolic is taking the big ones and decomposing them in simple particles. Well, as I was telling you, before, we always need to look at what the question is asking us, and it says most accurately. Because we have here option D that says it's a metabolic reaction. Well, yes, it is. Both anabolic and catabolic reactions are both metabolic reactions. But the question is asking me which is the most accurately describing it. And the most accurately describing it is option A, homeostatic reaction that has no meaning over here.